Hello and welcome to this beautiful episode that we've had today. We talked about transitions, we talked about change, and we've had a woman speaking about different ways of peeling off layers and her experiences. So we had Katie Larson, or Dr. Katie Larson, she calls herself Dr. Katie, talking to us about different ways that we experience life. She is a hypnotherapist, but we didn't actually talk a lot about hypnotherapy as such. But she's also had so many experiences of having to transition within her life through changes, through physical changes of moving from country to country, but also changes within her personal life. And it's just about peeling those layers and how to be the best version of yourself. And as one of the things that she says is, we get to choose to be here and we all have a purpose. So grab a cuppa and come and listen to this beautiful episode and really connect with your purpose and find your purpose because, yes, you also have a purpose. So now let's get into this wonderful conversation.
But you know the drill. Before we take you on this quest with Dr. Katie Larson, there is a reminder and an encouragement. Please click the subscribe button wherever you are watching, listening. Please follow and subscribe. That means so much to us, to our podcast, to our listeners, to our guests, to the whole universe that is on this journey with us. So if I can ask you for one thing, hit subscribe, hit follow, and now let's embark on this insightful quest with Katie. Hi, Katie. Welcome to the show.
Hi, it's my pleasure to be here.
We're so excited to have you on the podcast today. And to get us started, I would love to know a little bit about you, who you are, what you do, what brings you in today. But always my interest is what kind of gives you the energy, the fire every day in the morning to follow the path and do the journey and do the things that you do because I can list the job titles and I can list my accomplishments. I can give you a description of kind of my introduction, but for me, the curiosity comes from what gives you the purpose to do the work you do.
I love this question because we have these little spiels inside of like, and this is what I say when I'm introduced, and this is good for me because it keeps me on my toes and I recognize, part of what I do is I help people remember why they're here, right? And I think I am a character that is so tuned in to the fact that I chose this life and that I've had my own experiences that have really validated that through, hypnotherapy and trance states and altered states of consciousness. That's like, you chose to be here. Yes, it's hard, but you've got a purpose. Just stay the course. And I think as someone who feels a lot, like I'm a highly sensitive person, I am an empath and I'm an intuitive. Every once in a while, I forget my purpose because I'm so inundated by life and all of the things that you have to feel as a human in this little human body. And so sometimes I get in the weeds and I completely forget that I have a purpose. But I love that question because I recognize my purpose is to help people remember that you have one too. And so every once in a while, I have to remind myself of that, right? And I find that I get really motivated when I get feedback from people that have been like, oh my gosh, you really helped me see this, or now I understand where I'm in alignment, or people kind of like they're more connected to that nice relationship that we have with this higher self, this other version of us that's kind of calling the shots and reminding us of like, keep going, stay the course, you know? So yeah, I am. Professionally, I am a hypnotherapist, a somatic coach, and a growth coach. I've done that for over a decade, but my first career was I was a scientist and a science teacher. And so, like so many of your guests, I am a seeker. I'm a seeker through and through. And I think the original manifestation of seeking for me came in the form of science and nature. I was a field biologist, and so I got to travel to really cool locations like Kenya and Borneo and Mongolia. And I really always just wanted to understand, right? Like I was a kid who was in love with National Geographic magazines, and I wanted to just really figure out the way the world worked. And now knowing what I do, I can see how important that was to get a really solid foundation on the realities of humanity. I think like somebody asked me in another podcast, like, if you weren't doing what you do now, what would you do? And I think I would be an anthropologist because I'm fascinated by humans, right? And culture and how they interact with the ecosystem and stuff like that. So that was my first love. I was a high school science teacher, and I was a scientist in the summers because in the United States we have summers off. And then the way that I kind of evolved into doing what I'm doing now is I got a PhD, and my PhD has two titles. So the actual diploma is in something called leadership and change. And I went into the diploma for leadership because I thought I was going to continue to grow in the education world and I was going to continue to grow in academia, helping other teachers. And then my husband and I, in the meantime, we actually left the United States and we were living all over the world. We were chit-chatting before the recording about some places I had lived, but I was living in Spain, South Africa, and Singapore and Hong Kong and doing a lot of travels. And as I was traveling, I had to consistently reinvent. And like I was peeling off layers of who I thought I was. And literally my whole decade was like, who am I now? Who am I now? Who am I now? Who am I now? Right? You're just peeling off more and more and more. And I went into the diploma for leadership, but like midway through, I was like, so tell me about this change part of the diploma. Like, what are we talking about here? Because I've been doing a lot and it's exhausting. And I was recognizing how challenging it was to consistently look at myself, look at my assumptions, look at my beliefs, look at everything and peel them away just over and over and over again. And I was like, what is that even called? And my mentor at the time said, oh, that's transformative learning. Like you're doing a part of learning that a lot of adults don't choose to do because it's so challenging, right? And we get so disoriented. We're like, never mind, I'll just stick with what I was taught as a child and I won't even challenge this. But when we really push ourselves to challenge our assumptions and to kind of like critically self-reflect, then that is called transformative learning. So that is the doctor and Dr. Katie. That is what my diploma is in transformative learning. It's a form of change that we all go through. And when I was finished with the PhD, I had originally thought that I was going to want to stay in academia. And as a lot of highly sensitive people would totally admit to, sometimes we throw ourselves so deeply into something, we get so focused on something that when we're finished, we never want to see it again. And I was like, academia, I'm good. Like, I'm good. I was done with academia. I didn't want to stay with it primarily because of the sense of having to prove myself over and over again. I think you guys are nodding your head. I think there's a sense of when we're having to show like what we know all of the time and you're having to constantly prove it to an audience. That does a number on my nervous system. It does a number on my self-worth, where I'm like, I know what I know, just like let me go with it. So I decided instead of staying in academia, I wanted to take the knowledge that I had gained and give it to the people. And so that's when I began coaching first, and I called my business Growth Quests because so much of what my work was originally focused on was growth over change. Because I think a lot of times coaching comes from the perspective of like, you got to change this and you got to have a goal and then you got to change in order to get to the goal. And I thought, as a scientist who was very well versed in nature and who was really connected to a spiritual component of my life, which we'll talk about soon, I'm sure, I recognized, no, we're just here to grow. And like even if it's like a teeny tiny bit in one area and then like a ton in another area and a little medium size in another area, it's just growth. That's like what nature does. That's what humans are meant to do as well. And so Growth Quests was the name of my business. And I started with coaching and then evolved, right? As all things do. It was like a nice umbrella to say growth. Like, I just want you to grow. Okay. So what are the tools I'm going to use? Well, coaching was my first tool. And then hypnotherapy came in around the pandemic because, as all of us remember, we were kind of grounded, right? Like we couldn't fly, we couldn't travel. And as somebody I'm a explorer by nature. I'm a wayfinder. I'm a seeker. I was like, I gotta get out, what am I gonna do? And so I went back to a modality that I had used as a client for many years, which was hypnotherapy, because it's like an inner journey, right? So you're just kind of traveling within all of these realms that you can access in this unconscious state. And so I recognized like if I enjoy traveling internally so much, I want to give that to my clients because I find it really validates that this is a spiritual experience that we're on. And so I certified in hypnotherapy during the pandemic. And then the latest of tools that I've been using is Somatics. And I think it's somewhat new for people when they hear it. And a lot of people are like, what is that? But really, the way that I see Somatics intertwining with all of that work is like it's the relationship that we have between our emotions and our mind and our body, right? And so many of the things that we find when we do hypnotherapy are these trapped beliefs that we have in our unconscious, right? That like are also in our body, like we all have that, like you tense your shoulders up when you talk about something that happened to you in third grade, when you were embarrassed or you feel like your stomach clenches. And so somatics is using all of these gentle tools to feel safe within your body, to enjoy your body, and to recognize really what your body needs specifically and bringing that back into your awareness so that you can feel like you're actually inhabiting a body instead of kind of just floating around like so many of us empaths do. So, yeah, that was my long-winded answer, but the purpose is you have a purpose. And I just feel so grateful that I know my purpose is to remind you that. And that's what keeps me going every day.
I love how you start is you remind people that they've chosen to be here and have a purpose. It's like,
Yeah,
wow. It's just like, right, here's the deep end, and here's a
I
big,
know.
big reminder. So thank you so much for sharing that. And we can see the passion. I mean, and anybody listening or watching can hear and see the passion that you have for what you
Mm,
do. And I love how you, a scientist as
right.
well as spiritual, and bringing all this together, and the changing or the transitioning constantly, as you said, the
Yeah.
peeling off of these
Yeah.
different masks or layers, and just having to find yourself, or find or
Right.
be somebody for a short period and then change and then change. And change is really scary. As
Yeah.
humans, we generally don't like change. And when change happens, there's this uncertainty of who am I, because I'm not that person anymore,
Yeah.
but I don't know who I'm going to be. So it sounds really powerful what you help your clients with.
Thank
And
you.
you mentioned the science and having that spiritual connection to it. Can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. And I think you really paraphrased that well, of like how we're all kind of like leery of change until it happens to us, and then we're like, oh, what do I do with this? So I'm very well versed in that. Well, I'll start actually in childhood because I think some of our listeners are going to resonate with this. And they may have never put their finger on it or they may have ignored it, but I was a kid who had past life memories. And so I had, as a child, five, six, seven. It started to end around eight, nine, 10. But I just would have these little glimpses of a life, and it would be a daydream. And it would maybe, I'm looking back now, recognizing like actually it was triggered sometimes. Like sometimes it would come out of nowhere. Maybe, but I would also trigger it accidentally by doing certain things. And so they always felt more real than real. They weren't based on like a movie. It was like I would almost inhabit somebody else for a temporary moment and then I would get out. And I would chat about it with my parents, and they were really, they didn't like poo-poo it. They kind of like laughed and were like, oh, okay, that's Katie. But there was a couple of times that, then this is a really great one. If you want to expand on it later in the podcast, I can tell you more, but I'll just give you a snippet because it can be a long story. But when I was, young, one of the ways that I would trigger a memory was I used to like to play in my backyard next to a really big oak tree, and I would create these like what I called huts, where I would take like big branches and I would lay it on the tree trunk, and then I would fill in the branches with these little sticks, and I would go in it. and I would create these little like mud huts. I would put mud on the inside so no water could get through. And it just came naturally to me. But what happened while I was making that is I would go back into this memory of being a small boy with like darker skin. And I was having memories of like skinning a rabbit and like being able to take the fur off of the rabbit. And it was just so like, the whole process. And then I would go back to my like building my hut. And it was interesting because I never really thought it was weird. I was just like, that was me back then, and I didn't really have that self-consciousness yet. And so it was just very natural to me. And so that story evolves later and I'll put that as like a little pin if you're like, tell me more about it. But the spiritual connection was I felt as if I, as a child, had memories that I had come from somewhere perfect. And I think I'm noticing that now with my daughter. Like she's almost like disgusted by a lot of humanity. And she's 8 years old. She's nearly 8 years old. And she'll be like, I can't believe we're doing this, this, and this. That's just not fair. That's not right. And I think there's like a sense that highly sensitive people, empaths, like people who kind of lean a little bit more spiritually, we're almost born with this memory of this is not what we came from. Right. And the more work I do in my profession now as an adult, I see that we are remembering a perfect time and a perfect place and a space that we can exist in another realm, in another form of our being as an eternal being. And like, I think as a child, I kind of remembered that. And there were little things here and there where you kind of hold this belief system and then potentially you get exposed to things that validate it. And I remember like so clearly, I was so young. I was like maybe, oh gosh, like 12 years old, and I was in an English class, and my teacher was discussing Plato, the philosopher's like understanding of the world of ideals and how all of us come from this beautiful world, and then we go through a veil of forgetfulness, and then we are become on Earth, and we can't remember all of that, and then when we're on Earth, we have to kind of like relearn how to be in a human body. And I was only 12 years old, and I was like, that's it. Yeah, that's what I'm remembering that. And it's like I found like who am I talking to about this? Like I felt very lonely because I had these memories of these things. And so I kind of, went along in life like as you do. I was always kind of esoterically bent, meaning like I would go to the library and find all the like hidden knowledge books, and I would be like flipping through in the stacks about like Bigfoot and Atlantis and past lives and things like anything that like could strike me, I was like reading about. And I kind of let some of that go when I was in more of my science phase because you really have to kind of get into a materialist view. I didn't let it go completely as a potential, but I kind of had to focus a little bit more on like birds' level of cortisol and like, an amoeba's ability to swim in water. Like I had to like be a little bit more focused there. But when I was 28 years old, I was a scientist at the time. I was teaching science. I just had this like what I think is like a Saturn returns if you're into astrology, but it was like kind of an existential crisis, right? And I was in a church, and I'm not a churchgoer. I was just I just happened to be in a church as a tourist, and I said, like God, like I got a lot of existential angst here. What am I supposed to do? I feel so like, stuck and like I have to know something and I don't, and like what is going on? And I heard very clearly, you need to check into your past lives. And I was in a church, so I was kind of like, come again? Yeah, I was like, are you sure about this? Jesus, is that you? But it was very clear. It was like like an inner knowing, and it was in my right ear, and it's like you need to check into your past lives. So when I returned home from the tourist, the church, I, Googled somebody near me, and it was a hypnotherapist, and she brought me into my first past life regression. And it was very clear. It was not a memory that I had as a child, but it was a life where I was like a young boy. I was living in Scotland. I grew up to be a man who got married. I had children. I was a carpenter. I could like feel the plane of the wood as I was like, making it flatter. It was very visceral, very real experience. And when I was finished, the hypnotherapist was like, "You're really good at this. You should consider returning for our Life Between Lives session." And I was like, "I don't know about that." Like I gotta process this. I was still young and I wanted to integrate and really make sense of it. And I waited one full year to do another session, but in that year, everything in my life started to like align and make more sense. And all these little pieces from my childhood started to make sense. And I think like I began to like remember more than figure out of like, yeah, oh right, yeah, I chose this life. Oh yeah, like I have, So when I went into the next session 1 year later, that purpose is, and these are sessions I offer now as a professional, but it's like that was a lot more where you're trying to figure out, why did you choose this life? And where do you go when you're not alive? And how many other lives you got? And why do you have the people that you have in your life? What are your contracts with them, et cetera, et cetera. And that was when I was 29 years old, and it was so profound that it felt like without a shadow of a doubt I needed then now to use that to like springboard me. And a lot of what I learned in that session was actually quite prophetic. And I hadn't experienced, it says you're going to have a girl and a boy, and I didn't even want children yet. And I was like, really? That ended up happening. It's like you're going to live all over the world. I hadn't lived all over the world yet, and that ended up happening. And it had a couple of things that were kind of sad, that still haven't happened about like when my dad passes away. And so, it showed me what I was capable of handling, but also it showed me a framework that I kind of live my life by now. And that's kind of how we started this, is that like, okay, I did choose this life. I chose to make a big impact. I chose to focus on relationships. I chose to focus on healing things in my lineage. And throughout my life now as an adult, a lot of the things that happened in that original session for me not only have come true, but they've become more and more like foundational to my life. And so the way that I kind of like to go back to your original question of like how I kind of combine that with science is my PhD focus, well, I'll actually rewind even more. My undergrad and master's degree was in science, and that was very heavy on data of like, you got to measure this and you got to know how many of this. And it was very material and like, and very probably good way for me. I had to learn material evidence. But my PhD was in something that you needed phenomenological evidence. Super fun to say that word, phenomenological. But what it is just direct evidence, where it is the very beginning of creation of theories and hypotheses and understanding is when you have direct evidence, and it's usually from a human being like, I got this thing happening to me. And instead of us just overlooking it, we take it very seriously and we try to get as many other people as we can that have the same phenomenon going on in their life. And then we say, pattern, we have a pattern here. We need to understand this. And then that becomes a place of study. And so where I find a lot of my work now is kind of intersecting with like earlier versions of my life is the more clients I take and the more sessions that people have in this other realm, I'm like, what the F is this? Right? You're like, and the science brain is like, I want to map this place. Like I want to have all of this figured out because it's like there are patterns. And we can talk about that maybe in another question, but like there are patterns. There are things that every single person, no matter where they're from, experiences. There are ways of describing things that like people don't know another person that I've seen like for, several hours before ex described it one way and then another person describes it another way. So I can't help but leave my little science brain on and be like, there is phenomenological evidence that this is real. And I think that really helps me believe that are these things metaphors? Yeah, maybe your mind is making up a metaphor. I'm happy to entertain that as a reality. Happy for that to be what hypnotherapy sessions are about is metaphors. But the scientist in me is like, we're going somewhere. We're going somewhere. We're tapping something. We're meeting people. We're meeting things that are real. And so that begs the question, well, what is it? Right? And that's why I love my job.
I love your explanation. I don't think we've ever had anyone, and we had people who are kind of bridging, the science into the different realms. They're tapping onto different planes and different approaches. But I don't think we've ever had anyone so beautifully describing, even different scientific lenses from, oh, we need all the data and we need
Yeah.
confirmation from, as many, how many, we look at studies, how many people did we have in the study? What is the double blind? What is the
Right.
limits? Whatever, what's happening in there? Versus, oh, we have an outlier. Let's not completely ignore this one off. Let's be like, okay, what is it telling me? And is there more of them? And then let
Yeah.
me see what we can build from there.
Yeah. Thanks. And you know what's interesting? As you were speaking, I just got this image. So I'm gonna kind of I'm thinking and speaking at the same time, so bear with me. But my daughter has a hamster right now. And as everyone can imagine in their mind, a hamster in a tank with a little wheel. And I'm watching this hamster and it's like living in a very contrived environment, right? And I had a friend say to me like, "Oh, have you ever seen a hamster in the wild?" And I said, "Yeah, actually I have. When I was a scientist in Mongolia, hamsters were all over the place. Hamsters, gerbils, that's where they're from." And they're the most creative, cunning, clever little characters that you can ever imagine. And they would never, their energy and aura and spirit would never be captured in a little tank with a wheel, right? And so I recognize there is something that science, quote unquote, does that is akin to putting a hamster in a tank, right? We try really hard to replicate or sterilize or test or study something in a like small box. And what I'm noticing is there's like this a beautiful energy and aura about humanity and our souls and our spirits that is happening out in the real world and in the wild. And I think that's kind of what I feel I tap into with my coaching clients and my hypnotherapy clients and my somatic clients. Like we're doing stuff that's more real and you can't uh, dilute that um, into these little sterile boxes. And I guess I'm quite sensitive to that right now because I'm recognizing, some of us are becoming a little bit more attracted to like AI and things like that for our mental and emotional wellness. And I find that's really good for some of us because maybe, we've got a lot of fear around a person judging us or whatever. And the computer feels really, lack of judgment, which is great. But there is a very alive, beautiful, like energetic component to the work that we do. And we run the risk of losing that sometimes when we try to automate it or create like little boxes for it to live in. And I really don't want to go in that direction.
I love your story about the hamsters, the hamsters in Mongolia. And thank you. I never knew hamsters
I
came from
know.
Mongolia. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
You learn something new every day, or they say a teaching moment. It's
Yeah.
a school day every day. But picturing the hamster, I know that I've often used it and I've heard a lot of people say, I feel like a hamster on a wheel, just going
Yeah, so
round and
much of
round.
us.
But I love how you describe the hamsters and the gerbils in Mongolia, the wild ones who are not in these cages, with their wheels and the contrived, as you
Yeah.
said, environment. And I think, over the last, 200-300 years, there has been this contrived environment that we put ourselves into with
Yeah.
society. We have these box houses, we go to a box job, and our lives have become this cage with a hamster with a
I
hamster
know.
wheel in it. But
Which is
yet,
in the form of a phone now, right? Yeah.
yes,
It's just our
but
thumb. Yeah.
it is a thumb more than the wheel. But the thing is, it's that's not where we're from. We are
No.
from the freedom and being
Yeah.
out there. And I think more and more is people are wanting to break out of these boxes. I mean, I know
Yeah.
myself and Lenka, we are like we don't want to be in
Yeah.
these contrived environments, and we are noticing through our guests speaking, through just people that we're talking to in our lives as well, is more and more people are want to break out of this contrived environment to live in, because it's not healthy. It's not
Right.
a place where as humans we're not designed to be in. And it's very much it feels like it takes away the humanity and the
Yeah,
humanness from us. Whereas if we are free and living in nature, and I'm not necessarily that you've got no roof over your head, but connecting with nature and
connecting is a good way. Yeah.
seeing the stars, seeing the changing moon from new moon to full moon,
Yeah,
and experiencing the wind and the rain, and in it's just we need that as humans,
I
and
agree.
it's something that I've been really noticing and impacting. So as I mentioned before we started, I've moved from the UK to South Africa, and in the UK we had a garden and we were out
Mm,
every day. I could stand barefoot in the garden. I saw the moon every night, could see it in the different phases.
love that.
But where my mother lives, because this is where I'm at right now, she's on a second floor apartment,
Yeah.
and you can't, and there's beautiful green trees. I'm around greenery, but I don't see the night sky. And I'm
Yeah.
not putting my, unless I go down the stairs and make an effort and find it, it's not as, I'm not on the ground as much as I was. And just in that short period, noticing a huge difference. And I think that, I start to really appreciate people who live in apartment blocks, who go from, down a lift into a car, into an office. When
Hmm.
do they actually get to see nature? When do they get to see the sun or the moon or the stars, or just put their feet on the ground?
Yeah.
And this is why I say we as humans in society are very much confined in our little cages or
Yeah.
tanks with a wheel, okay, a phone that just goes round and round. And I think more and more people are saying, no, I don't want this. I want to get out, and selling up in the cities and moving into the countryside and just seeing that. And I think this is such a pivotal time
Yeah.
in life, in the world at the moment, is more and more people are just saying, no, I want
Yeah.
off this wheel. I want to have a bit more control than the four tank walls or cage
Same.
walls or house walls or whatever they are, and just really connect. But
Love
then
that.
comes the, but how do I do that?
I
How
know.
do I go about it? Yes, you can go stand in the garden barefoot, but you're still in that contrived. So
Yeah.
for somebody who's done a lot of peeling and
I
transitionings,
know.
is how can people find a way to slowly break those walls? Because you might want to, but not necessarily
Yeah.
know how to, because it's change, it's
I know.
scary, it's different, it's a transition, but also sometimes it might not be very practical
I
if
know.
you. So what advice can you give listeners who are thinking these walls of this cage are just no more, but how can I break free without totally, you know,
Yeah.
a huge change or selling up for something that's not practical?
I know. And I'm gonna have like a million answers to this and it'll all be going around all over the place and there'll be metaphors involved. Because as you were talking, I was like, that's a good point. Writing things down at that writing things down. It's interesting. I said this to a client recently, and it was a somatic client. So I will act out for those of us watching the video, and I'll try to say it, clearly for the audio people. But I had her hold her hand as a bird. And I was like, make a bird. And this is you. And like, feel how good it feels to move your wings. And this is the way you feel when you're out biking and running and exploring. Like, you like that. She liked to be out. She didn't want to go in the gym. She wanted to be out in nature, which I'm very similar to her. And I said, okay, now I'm going to hold that bird and I'm going to make a little nest. So we put her little bird inside of a nest. And I said, and these are all of the things that you've created in your routine to make sure that the bird can go away and come back to the nest and go away and come back to the nest. And we listed all of the different things and how like that supports her. And so it was just, creating a routine for her that she knew every day she could get out at a certain time and do it. Or making sure she had a babysitter or whatever. Like it was just a routine that gave her a nest, right? And then I took my hands around the bird and I started to squeeze the bird. And I said, now I want you to tell me where you've created a cage. right? Like, where have you created the cage for the bird? Because that was her complaint, is that she felt like she was like one of these jack in the boxes where you're like all squished up and you can't get out. But she recognized that there was a lot of things in her life that were like out of her control that felt like the cage. But then there were some things in her life that were the cage, right? That she made the cage. And some of them were, boundaries, right? Like not being comfortable enough to say that she needed the babysitter and like the guilt that came with that. Or, recognizing, oh, I'll just put myself last again, and so like how do we then really value that your flying around is really worth that? And so the more we understood what the cage was for her, the more we understood some of it was out of her control, and that was like the cultural societal cage that like, I gotta have a job, like I gotta work all those days. But then like we were like, okay, well, what to you feels like opening the cage and more like a nest? And so that's just one metaphor of like, look, we all need nests. And sometimes the nest will feel like a mini cage, but the nest should be the most comfortable part of our routines and the things that make us feel safe and the places and experiences that we need in our life to allow us to be that little bird that flies away. But what we often don't realize is when that little nest becomes a cage. And so some of it is, sitting on your phone and scrolling instead of going out and putting your feet in the garden, right? And some of it is put on you by societal expectations and things like that. And so looking at the societal expectations and seeing which ones can I break? Do you really need to go to that, ugly sweater party with your colleagues for the whole time? Can you leave a little early? That kind of a thing. So, that's just like a really metaphorical thing of how I think we all accidentally get into cages. And it's funny, like I wrote down, I really like Pink Floyd. And there's a part in one of the Pink Floyd songs, Wish You Were Here, that we as a couple, my husband and I, really used when we were choosing all of those moves and things like that in our 30s, where they have a song that like a line that's like, what would you rather choose, a walk-on part in the war or a lead role in a cage? And it's like so many of us choose the lead role in a cage because it's safe, it's predictable, it is quite contrived, but it's like you know what you're going to get. It's your box, like just leave me alone. I'll just live in my cage. It's a lead role, right? You feel great. Or do you want the lead, like the walk-on part where you don't know what you're going to be in a war? So like you could be the main person, you could be a like character all the way in the back that's like helping clean up the mess, like you could be the healer, whatever, but like you're just showing up. And that does take a lot of courage because you don't know what you're going to get. That also is addicting because you don't know what you're going to get. And if you like slot machines like me, where you're like, oh, like I could have a jackpot 1 second, or I could have nothing, but like the jackpot, And so we actually got addicted to the walk-on part in the war. And so it's like there are, polarities here at play that you can kind of find a really nice middle ground. But sometimes there's these little moments of bravery that are going to be the how of like, you know what? I am really comfortable with my routine, but for some reason, I'm going to do something spontaneous today. That little chunk of bravery takes you a little bit out of the cage, right? I think another really practical, like, clear, realistic thing of the how of nature and feeling more connected, excuse me, find the nature that you can actually put into the cage if you have no other choice, right? So lining your house with plants, feeding the birds, feeding the squirrels. I'm single-handedly keeping the squirrels in my neighborhood alive by feeding them every morning, right? So like that's my kids and I do that. But recognizing where are there moments for me to create a relationship with a living thing. It could be anything, right? A pet, a plant, anything that you feel a calling to just hold in your ecosystem of your little home, that's a way to reconnect. And I also think, Lenka's like out doing her van life, right? There is something about a lot of us, not everybody, but there are natural born explorers, wayfinders, seekers. I'm really in love with this book called The Wild Sensitive because it describes when you are a combination of a highly sensitive person and a high sensation seeking person, you become this new thing that they've nicknamed the wild sensitive. And that wild sensitive is a wayfinder. They want to go out and find new ways of being in the world and explore the world, not for just like boredom's sake, but because it's meaningful. There's meaning there. And I think that's something that when you feel a calling to explore and you feel drawn or a craving to get out of that little cage and get out of the, contrived reality that we've all put ourselves into, you have to honor that. Honor that by finding little moments to explore. Get off your phone. Go and touch dirt. Get out in the car and explore. Get in an airplane if you can afford it, but actually do it. And I think that, when we look back at our ancestors, all of us have lived somewhere that our ancestors got to, right? And so we are speaking to people who have come in from a lineage of people who left. And so it is natural for us to be that inside. And so it's honoring that version of you that really needs that and finding little ways that can make it happen, both practically and realistically. Hopefully that was, enough of an example. But yeah, I think you just do it. You do it. You find ways to do it. And if it's, one day you go somewhere in your backyard, great. And then the next day you fly halfway across the world, great. But see if you can honor that part of you.
We've talked a lot about, change and creating, or not creating, but having that identity and having to make the changes, whether it's a forced change or a change that you choose to do. And as you mentioned in the beginning, you're here to remind people that they've chosen
Yeah.
to be here and to have a purpose is, as I said earlier, change can be sometimes really scary, and it can be so overwhelming, and it can stop somebody from doing something. And as somebody who's done a lot of changing, how can people find a way to cope with it or deal with it, or even not have it as such a scary thing? Because we try not to have a lot of change in our life, and we get
Yeah.
into these ruts and into these routines, but yet change can be really empowering, can be an absolute blessing and even sometimes a forced change when you don't have a choice, but it's
Yeah.
happened and a change has to happen. But instead of looking at it or experiencing it as like, oh my God, this has happened, and having that anxiety or overwhelm and just like, oh, what do I do? Is how can we flip that on its side, on its back, front,
Yeah.
side, or whatever it is, flip it and think, okay, great, there's a change in front of me, or I'm in the middle of change. How can I really embrace it and make the most out of it and look at it as something positive and not like something scary and negative?
Oh my gosh, this is a perfect question for me this year. You're gonna love this. And I'm gonna answer it in a way I've never answered it before. So thank you for this question because I'm gonna have to wing it, but I think I have a better understanding of how I should answer this based on my year. So I live in the state of Florida in the United States, and Florida had one of the worst hurricanes, two hurricanes in a row, and a hurricane is like a typhoon, and it's just a big storm. And last year, I purchased a home in May. I renovated it June and July. I moved in August, and then I lost it in September to a hurricane completely. Two in a row, actually. The bottom st stories was the first one into a flood, and then the top story was the second one to wind. Now, what's interesting about this experience for me was at first I was so numb to what was going on because I was like, right, lost a house, got to move again. I've moved 25 times in 20 years, big deal. All right, you move, and I was just like, move on, and you get into this survival mode, right? But like you mentioned, sometimes we choose to move, we choose to change, we choose to go all over the world, we choose to peel off the masks, and that's really empowering. And sometimes it gives us this false sense of like, you get to choose all change, you get to choose anything that happens to you. It's all on you, baby. And then an act of God or a catastrophe comes and is like, oh yeah, what about this? And then you're like, oh, right. And so when I first started handling this catastrophe, I used all of the tools that I had prior. And I think that really helped me. I was like, right, you got to find somewhere to live right away. Okay, you got to just throw stuff away. You got to purge. You got to do this. And you use what you have. And I had those tools, thank God. But then you start to realize you don't have all of the tools to handle something that's thrown at you because you've never experienced it before. And so you have to create new tools. And this is where I think my answer is going to become new. I think based on what I do for a living, I have a very unique uh, way of understanding, like you're almost toggling between this little human body that we have with a human nervous system and a human interface. And you can toggle to this very spiritual side of you that can look at everything from a higher perspective. And you can kind of see everything that's going on and why it has to go on and how it's going to affect you in a good spiritual way. And we're just toggling all day back and forth between these two things. And I think what I did originally when I was going through my own catastrophe, I was like, come on, let's time to live up in that spiritual side because she knows that this is good for her growth and that this is going to be the best thing that ever happened to her in a year. Let's hang out in the spiritual realms. And I quickly tried to spiritually bypass what was going on. I was, making jokes and I was, saying all of these things that are like, oh, but I really think that this will be good for us in the long run, and I could really see this amazing experience from a very high level. But what I was forgetting was I had this little version of me that was actually living through it, that had this little nervous system and was interacting with, a lot of stress and a lot of other characters that were bad actors, to be honest. I got unfortunately really taken advantage of and lost a lot of money from people who were kind of like parasites to storm survivors. And this little nervous system, human body, really didn't know how to take it on, really didn't know what to do. And instead of really like nourishing that body, a lot of times I was just like, well, see you later, body, and just went up to this other realm, right? And tried to dissociate from it. And so a lot of the lesson that I had to learn, and perhaps maybe one of the listeners right now who may be going through, a catastrophic diagnosis or the death of a loved one or, a breakup where it was like thrust upon you and you're like, what the hell? What I would recommend is getting in touch with the way the human version of you is going to respond and be completely loving, self-compassionate, give yourself plenty of grace that is afforded to you in that spiritual realm. In that spiritual realm, everything's fine. Everything's fine up there. So no wonder you want to stay up there. But what we need to do is we need to bring that wisdom and that knowledge into the human version of you, and you need to take care of yourself almost like a parent would to a child. And so I found I was really hard on myself for a while going through a change thrust upon me because I was like, what the hell, Katie? You got all these tools. Do like just use them. And they weren't working, right? And I think a lot of the reason they weren't working was because I was using old tools and I had to learn new tools. And some of the new tools were so simple, I refused to think that they would work, meaning like rest. You know what you got to do? Rest. And I was like, that, not me, and it's like, yep, you did. Like, I actually really learned this year how to fully rest, how to shut off phones, screens, and fully rest. And, how do you find pleasure in little physical sensations because your body is so stressed and tense? How do you introduce pleasure to your body so that it knows it's safe, right? And I was like, that's too simple. But really, when I started using these simple new tools, and I'll just share actually, if somebody out there is going through this, the way I really recognized how to handle this was I really went back into my chakras. I'm a very chakra oriented person, and The first three chakras are what really need to be held when you're going through a catastrophe. And I always imagine them as like these little nesting dolls that you have inside of you, right? They kind of stack together. And because that's kind of when those nesting dolls of ages of yourself went online. And so your red chakra is your root chakra, and it's the little nesting doll that's just a little baby infant you. And so, in order to care for that little baby infant you, the red chakra, you just need to feel safe. You need to feel fed. You need rest, right? And that is it. Like you really just, that's what grounds us is like when you think of your little infant you as the little red one that's in your chakra. And then the next one is like holding that one, and that's the toddler you, the orange sacral chakra. And toddler you needs to have fun, be in her pleasure, needs to feel like they can create and be silly and spontaneous and, nurture and vulnerable with their feelings. And it's okay to have a temper tantrum. And so you have to think of the little orange nesting doll as like the little toddler version of you. And when you start to feel angsty, take care of the toddler version of you of like give yourself more fun, give yourself creativity, give yourself some spontaneity. And those two are the number one like way to begin. But then I think of the yellow one, the solar plexus, as like your inner teenager, because that's your ambition and your willpower and your understanding of who you are when it comes to like a challenge, right? And like, guess what? That version of you, like, it doesn't want to handle any of this bullshit when you're going through a catastrophe. Like, they're like, yeah, I'm good, right? But once you take care of the baby and the toddler, eventually that teenager will come back and they will assert themselves and they will be able to handle the things that are going and they will put forth the effort and energy to clean up the mess, but not unless you care for the baby and the toddler first. And I think I wanted to jump right into the teenager that had all of this, like, come on, right, this is what we do. We got to finish this, finish that. And I burnt out. I burnt out way too quick. And I realized that in order to actually sustain myself through this very big upheaval and change and catastrophe, I needed to carry a little baby Katie and little toddler Katie. And that is what really helped me, align myself a lot more. And just to throw in those other chakras for, good measure, that heart chakra is the one that's got all that self-compassion to even get that stuff done, right? Of like, I need some grace. I need some care for myself. I need to forgive myself for the things that are going to go poorly and that I don't know what I'm doing, that I haven't learned yet. That's all heart. That is all heart. And then what I didn't expect to learn is that in that throat chakra, I was learning how to assert myself in situations where I had learned in the past, just be polite. And I had to learn how to stand up to contractors that were taking my money and screwing me over. I had to say to my partner, no, I need to rest today. I need to tell my kids we're not going to the birthday party because mommy's too tired. And that was really challenging, right? But like that honesty was something that is in your throat chakra, like it needed to be out in this, alignment of healing. Or you just swallow, 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 swallow. And then before you know it, you have to explode because you really weren't, speaking your truth. And so again, that little third eye is kind of like managing all of that at once. It's just figuring out when you need what and getting some guidance from the universe and from your body and then putting it all forward. But I think that I really learned a lot on how important my energy being balanced and how important it is to care for myself. And I really couldn't have done it if I didn't have those tools. I think I would still be in bed. It was a crazy year.
Wow, it sounds like it's been a very crazy year, and I've never heard of the chakras like nesting
Yeah,
dolls.
I
But
like
it's
that
like,
image.
wow, that makes so much sense. So it's a new way of looking at the chakras and um yeah, as nesting dolls, and that sort of, well, I it made sense to me, and the
Yeah,
visualization made sense. So thank you for sharing that. And there's been some very good tips. Like you said,
good.
you don't have to lose a house to
No.
utilize those. Just any change, big or small, the same it can have the same physical and mental impact as a
Yeah.
big one. And I think this is something that we forget, oh, it's just a small thing, but not realizing the impact that it has. So
Yeah. And
thank you
sometimes you
for
need to take care
that.
of the baby one for like weeks. And I think like one of your former guests, Gabby, is who I work with. She's a somatic practitioner and a trauma-informed PT, and she really helped me because I was like, right, like I think I need to like keep moving forward. She's like, is that what your body really wants to do? And I was like, no. What does it really want to do? I'm like, it just wants to sleep. You need to sleep. And so it was like there was a long period of time that I just needed to care for the little baby and like rest, feed, get up, move forward, change the diaper, like just lowest possible expectations for the little baby. And then I can move into a little bit more. But it's like, gosh, we don't really think of that as an adult because we don't really have that luxury sometimes, right? We feel like, right, I gotta clean this up, I gotta do this, I gotta live my life, I gotta go to work, da da da. But it's like as like an internal way of relating to yourself during the change, really remember you're just a little baby. You're just a little baby, and this is the first time that that little baby's ever gone through a disaster or catastrophe. So it's okay if you need to rest for like a week, you know. So that was news. That was news to me this year, and I learned that the hard way, but I did learn it.
Thank you for that. And yeah, it's all that wisdom that's come, all that wisdom that has come there. And this is the part where we have the gold nuggets. So good luck having another brilliant gold nugget because you've just given us a huge one. So this is where we ask, Katie, can we please have your gold nugget?
Ooh, I love this. Well, I'm going to purposely challenge our distaste for boxes by putting it in a different perspective that might also help us where we're like super overwhelmed with how big things are too. Because I think some of us also at this moment, we're on our phones a lot. And so we kind of assume that so much of the world's experience is in our direct backyard in this exact moment. And some of it is, right? Like some of it is, but some of it's not. And so perhaps one of the ways that I have learned to be okay with being in a nest, less so a cage, is kind of shrinking down my reality to like 150 people. And I recognize that there's these little books. I don't know if you guys are familiar with them, but my kids read them. And so some of the listeners will remember these books. And if not, I'm sure every culture has a version of this. But the author and illustrator was called Richard Scarry. And he has these little like characters that are in like these little towns. And they have the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, and like all of the people that have these like original jobs, right? And when I was reading that the other night to the kids, I recognized, that is really how humanity was evolved to experience the world, in the past is like we are in these little hamlets, these little towns, these little, communities, and we become that thing for the community, right? So like we are the carpenter or we are the shoemaker or we are the whatever. And by being that what that community needs, that's the purpose that we offer the world, right? And so let's go full circle of like, I help people remember that they came into this world with a purpose. You did come with a purpose for the biggest world, but you also came in for a purpose for the small community that you're in. And sometimes, especially mothers with young children, we need to remember just how valuable our purpose is with our family, with our immediate surrounding community, with our little bit bigger community. But like once you reach 150 people, it's really hard to keep track of, right? And so my little nugget of wisdom is how can you become the version of you that is the most valuable for that 150 person community? And so sometimes I make a joke, like when I market myself on social media, I'll be like, it's your friendly neighborhood hypnotherapist, because I want people to know that within their community, they have someone that does what I do. But it doesn't have to be your profession, right? Like you can be known as the world's best listener in your group of five girlfriends. You can be known as a person that brings the fun in your couple, your little couples. And the purposes that we have, they're very fluid, right? And they're not very often tied to our job, believe it or not. So when you go up into your higher self, what I'm noticing, remember I told you there's patterns, and you ask your higher self, and every single person does this, like, is my purpose higher self? It's very rarely, oh, you're going to be an accountant and you're going to earn a lot of money for this one company that, is billionaires that are at the top. Good job. It's usually a very vague but important purpose. So it's usually something like you're here to educate, you're here to create bridges between people, you're here to practice unconditional love, you're here to learn how to be creative. Like it's super like vague, and sometimes the client's like, "Are you serious?" Like it's almost too easy. But when you use that little nugget of information from your higher self, you start to realize, you know what? I am the best bridge maker in my group of friends. I am the best person of helping people's relationships in my little community. And then you start to really wear those shoes of that archetype of that person in the community that does those things. And you really double down on your purpose and you'll kind of start to find your genius and you start to really believe that that is a part of you that's always existed. It's the golden thread that's kept you going. It's the part of you that like keeps you excited and like you said in the beginning, like gets you out of bed in the morning, right? And everyone's is different. Yours is not going to be the same as your partner's. It's not going to be the same as your best friend's. It's going to be quite unique. But once, if you do a session with me, or even if you just meditate with your higher self and ask, what's my purpose? You'll get that information and then you use it as like the fire, right? Like that keeps you kindled, that keeps you burning, that keeps you going. And I think without that, that's when we shrivel. That's when we get depressed. That's when we kind of throw in the towel. And in this day and age, we can't afford that. We need us to feel like we're, connected to those purposes. So that's my nugget is like, hey, you know what? I know we said we don't like boxes, but what if we had a really nice screened in porch that was 150 people, and then you just be the thing that you were here to do for them and do it well.
Thank you so much. That is a beautiful gold nugget, and it's very powerful. And it is, it's almost, as you said, getting back to your immediate area or community and not so much out there. So thank you so much for sharing that.
It's my pleasure. I hope it all makes sense. I know I use a lot of metaphors and cultural references, so I hope the audience can connect.
So yes, I'm sure our audience will connect because metaphor, well, for me, I love a metaphor. So
Same.
I've enjoyed it. But for our listeners, if they, have heard your story or they want to know more, or they just like, wow, I love Katie's energy and I want more of Katie, where can people find you?
Yeah, so even though I love my community and I work in my small town of St. Petersburg, Florida, I do work globally with my clients because I've lived all over the world, so I have clients all over the world. So my website is growthquests.com and I'm on Instagram at Dr. Katie Growth Quests. And yeah, I love meeting people and working with folks that find me from podcasts. So just let me know that's how you found me in one of my comment sections when you reach out for a free discovery call. And then what I do is I just create these little things that I call a growth quest, right? And I use all my different modalities depending on, it's customized for you. But you just have a free discovery call. We to figure out, okay, what would be a really cool focus of growth for you in this moment? And then we use whichever modalities, you resonate with the most, and we grow. And you will change your life, but you will actually become more who you've always been than somebody new.
Fantastic. And if people want to connect with you, we will leave the links in the description below. They can just click and find, and if they're ready to start a quest with you, they can book and go on a journey. So thank you so much for all the wonderful wisdom and insights you've given us. It's definitely been such a pleasure to be here and be able to be part of this conversation and listen to your stories and connecting the dots and bringing in, as we said, different metaphors to explain things. We sometimes talk about similar things, but there's always a unique angle and unique explanation. And so much of how you describe things really resonated with me. And I'm sure our listeners will love it as well. But on this podcast, we're a little greedy and we're always trying to squeeze in one last question. We cannot get enough. And because the mission for us here is to explore different ways of living happier, healthier, more fulfilled lives, to find ways how we can lean more into our lives. I'm always curious, what gives you life right now?
Dancing. Dancing. Yeah. I think dancing saved my life the last year and a half after the storm. I found a reconnection with moving my body in a nonlinear way was really helpful to like get out the stress and release the trauma. I found my love of disco dancing because our town has a disco and it's got the light up floor, and I would go and I would be like, I feel so alive here. And I can bring my kiddos with me to another event my community has called Movement Mondays, where there's roller skates and hula hoops and different things. And so for me, there is no better feeling in my body than dancing. And I think if you or maybe somebody who also is feeling a little disembodied or dissociated from their body right now, I would really recommend put on your favorite song, move your hips, move your shoulders, just start to loosen it up. And before you know it, you'll be dancing like you were when you were a little kid, and you will really release a lot and you'll feel more alive than you have in a long time. That's one works for me.
I love that. And when you said like a little kid, if you see toddlers, and I'm thinking of that little chakra, that
Yeah.
toddler,
It's a
they
sacral
always
energy
they
one.
always get up and dance. Yeah.
Yeah.
So dancing sounds like a fantastic way and allow that little toddler just to have fun.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences, your energy, your stories with us today. It's been really great to
Thank
listen
you.
to the way you describe things. And as Lenka said, it's having that different perspective. It might be the same or similar type of advice that you're giving, but you say it in such a unique Katie way. And I love,
Yeah.
with the
Appreciate that.
metaphors and that. So, just taking the time to share all that. We really appreciate it. And thank you so much.
It's absolutely my pleasure, and I appreciate you reaching out. I've enjoyed this hour, and I hope to return again.
And for our listeners, what have you got from today? We've talked quite a bit. We've had the spiritual journey and we've talked a bit about change and transition and how change can help with the transition or transition helps with the change, whichever way you want to look at it. But what have you got from today? What aha moments? What's really helped you to maybe align something or peel another layer off or just give you the courage to be brave and do something small or something bigger that you might not have thought about doing before? We would love to know your thoughts. We'd love to hear your stories or what you got from today. But until next time, we'll talk to you soon. Bye.